Hello there, it's Silver. This is Oceanhorn 2, Knights of the Lost Realm. So this is an action RPG that is coming to PC after being released elsewhere first, but it's coming to PC as a version with some extra improvements and a lot of the quality of life and content updates and things that the previous versions have had. So this game is going for the sort of 3D Zelda formula, basically, and I guess the first question to ask is this Zelda with the serial numbers filed off? And, I mean, kind of, but also not exactly. I do appreciate that it has its own ideas. Even though the game is very clearly going for that specific style, it also has its own puzzle designs and item ideas and things, and it doesn't feel like just a blatant copy of any particular Zelda game. So although it's using that formula, it's not using it to a degree that it feels like a ripoff or anything like that. I think it has enough of its own identity to still stand on its own. And to be fair, this is the PC platform where we don't have Zelda. So if you want to play a Zelda game on PC, you have to emulate it. That's the only way. We don't have any official releases. And there's also the point that, on PC at least, the indie scene, when they tackle the Zelda formula, it's always the 2D Zelda formula almost every time. Games like A Link to the Past are usually cited as an inspiration for a ton of really good games, so seeing something that actually takes on the 3D formula instead is interesting, because you just don't see that anywhere nearly as often. I do appreciate that the plot of this game, to start off with, is something that you've simultaneously seen before, but it is also being done a little bit differently. So this is one of those plots where there are 3 sacred objects, 3 artifacts that, of course, need to be gathered, but in this case, it's not exactly what you think, because you actually start the game off with all of them already gathered in one place. You are not traveling to the ends of the world to find them and bring them together, but rather, you're traveling to the ends of the world to bring them back to where they were originally placed. So it's sort of like the dungeon crawling was already done, and now you have to actually go back through those dungeons yourself and put them back where they belong. Now, the world structure of this game is a really interesting one because it actually uses 2 things I've never seen together before. So you are probably aware of the traditional 3D Zelda overworld. You explore through the overworld, and within this overworld will be several dungeons and some towns for you to visit and things like that, and then, of course, the big story areas. And this game has that, but it also has a world map function a lot like a JRPG, where you sort of zoom out of the overworld and go to this big world map, and you can then go to nodes on the world map and actually zoom back into the overworld there and explore it. So the game sort of has 2 different layers of overworld, in quotes, where one of them is the more normally explorable big field, like your Hyrule Field type areas, and then the other is this actual full-on world map where you can use vehicles like boats and airships and things to explore around and then land in specific places of interest to go into them, a lot like how a JRPG usually works. The way the sort of puzzles and combat and everything is structured in this game is also a little bit different because it's structured around this thing called the caster gun, which is a gun, but it uses bits and bobs from the environment to fuel various spells. So you have a sort of general just damage firing mode that simply fires a projectile out that has a bit of a travel time, so you get to lead enemies sometimes to hit them. But you've also got 3 different spells that you'll get throughout the early parts of your adventure, and these are basically your Zelda items. So you know how items in Zelda have 2 functions. They have the puzzle-solving function and the combat function, right? Like bombs or the boomerang or the bow, they all have multiple ways to use them depending on what you're trying to do. And these spells in this game are the replacement for that. You'll get a fire spell that, of course, does damage over time to enemies and is really good for AoE damage because you don't have a lot of other methods to do that, and sometimes there will be a large number of enemies in an arena at any given time, so it's nice to have the ability to affect them all at once. But it also can burn things, of course, because it's fire, so it will burn down wooden things and destroy barricades that you couldn't otherwise get through, or knock things off of ledges that you couldn't get to because you burned the ledge and stuff like that. You also get a lightning spell, and the lightning spell is more used for puzzle solving than for combat, but it does still have a combat usage. It fires a very slow-moving projectile that can do like chain lightning damage in between enemies. But for puzzles, you'll find these little pylons, these sort of power pylons, throughout certain places, and they're usually around this little plaque on the floor that looks like a lightning bolt to show you where to stand. And you stand on these, and then you can fire the lightning projectile at one of these pylons and then draw through the air the path that the lightning will take. And the idea is to draw across the various pylons to one sort of diamond-shaped one at the end in order to actually complete some sort of puzzle. So it's a relatively simple puzzle-solving tool, but it's effective because it tends to make you search out your environment to find all of these pylons to actually connect them all together, and sometimes some of them will be blocked off by bits of the scenery and stuff that you have to move or otherwise get rid of first in order to complete the puzzle. And then last, you'll get an ice spell, and this one has pretty equal usage because in combat it freezes enemies in place, which is very useful for a lot of reasons, but it also amplifies the damage they take while they're frozen, which makes it extremely powerful against some of the optional bosses and things in the game, especially if you combine it with very well-timed bombs that you can airburst to do huge damage to them while they're frozen. It's a little bit tricky to get used to, but you can do it, and it also, of course, can freeze platforms onto water. It works like ice arrows, basically. You fire it into water, and it makes some platforms you can use to get across, because the swimming in this game is a lot like Wind Waker swimming, basically, where you can only stay in water for a very brief period of time before you drown. You also have a couple of other tools. You got a sword and a shield. The sword has a basic combo as well as the last hit of the combo, tending to sort of knock enemies around or otherwise stun them, which is nice. So enemies don't get interrupted very easily in this game, so it's often useful to either use the gun's basic function to shoot them or to use the sword's combo ender to sort of stun them a little bit. You can also get some bombs, which have the expected effects. They're very useful in combat. I tend to find they have quite a significant blast radius on them, but they do damage you very badly if you stay too close to them, and it's kind of hard to tell when they're going to explode because they don't do the thing where like Zelda bombs flash red faster and faster right before they blow up, but these don't do that, so you just sort of have to get used to how long they take to explode. You've got a shield for blocking basic projectiles as well as parrying enemy attacks. If you guard right before you get hit, you can parry them and actually interrupt them that way, which is nice. You can get some critical hits in as a response, and you'll also eventually will get a better shield that acts kind of like the mirror shield, allowing you to like deflect beams and stuff. And you'll also be getting a grappling hook, and the grappling hook is really when the game opens up. Before you get it, your exploration is not... it's pretty flat, right? You don't really have any other traversal abilities. You do have the basic Zelda jump, where you don't have a jump button, but instead as soon as you run to a ledge, it jumps automatically, and it works fine for the most part, although I find it can be a little bit overzealous and cause you to jump when you didn't mean to. I think it sometimes activates farther away from the edge of a platform than it needs to, basically, so that sometimes platforming is a little bit difficult in this game, because when you land, you tend to roll, and that means if you're sort of pressing forward when you land, you'll automatically roll, and you'll probably get close to the edge of whatever you landed on to jump again automatically and just sort of throw yourself off into the void if you're not careful. So it does make some of the platforming a little bit finicky, because you have to worry about how close you're going to land to an edge in order to not automatically jump again. So while you're exploring, you'll come across all sorts of dungeons and things. A lot of this game takes place in dungeons. I think it actually does dungeon crawling pretty well, because the dungeons all feel pretty unique to each other. It does a good job of giving you like a variety of things to solve and stuff. It doesn't feel like you're repeating the same puzzles or anything dungeon after dungeon. Some of them are pretty short, but I would prefer a series of shorter but still relatively unique dungeons, as opposed to peppering a whole bunch of the same thing over and over in a world just to say that there's more of them, you know what I mean? So I think having a fewer number is fine, as long as they're relatively unique. There are a good number of rewards to find, at least. In addition to all the pieces of equipment and stuff that I've talked about, you'll also get things like heart pieces. Hearts in this game are divided into 3 segments rather than 4, so this means that each heart is sort of 3 hits of damage, although of course different enemies do different amounts of damage when they hit you. But this also means that a heart container is made up of 3 heart pieces, so you've got to go and find 3 of them out in the world, usually in hard-to-reach chests and things, or some hidden stuff, or oftentimes as a reward for different side quests and things. That'll let you extend your life gauge. You'll also notice that there are these gems you can find and equip. This is another thing the game likes to reward you with for side dungeons and things. These gems that you can slot into your equipment. Pretty much all of your spells, as well as a lot of your other pieces of equipment, have 2 different slots in them, and they have various stats. They have a power, a might, which is confusingly a different thing than the power, and a charge. And the power is just how strong they are, and the charge is how fast their cooldown is. But might does a different thing depending on what you're talking about. So might for the fire spell makes its AoE larger, but might for the ice spell makes the ice platforms last longer. Things like that. It kind of depends on what you're equipping it onto, and some things don't have might at all, like your sword. So you do feel a relatively good sense of progression as you're going through the game, since you're getting new spells and new pieces of gear that open up new areas, and of course extending your life gauge and getting these shards to enhance your abilities and things. So yeah, I'd say it does a good job of making you feel like you're getting stronger. You'll also be gathering stuff from the environment quite a lot. There is not a crafting system in this game, but the way that your spells are fueled is by getting bits and bobs from the environment to actually fill this gauge, and once this gauge fills up, you get 1 charge of whatever it is you got. So if you keep getting a bunch of fiery stuff, you'll eventually fill this fire gauge, and you'll get 1 charge of your fire spell. And it works this way for all of your spells, as well as your basic ammo, which just gets charged from getting like random bits of scrap and things from the environment. There's also a healing spell that you can cast from the radial menu. You have a radial menu that lets you just select whatever you're equipped with at the time, and you can cast it directly from the menu. You don't actually equip this one. And it gains charge by getting hearts and stuff that restores health while you're already at full health. So this means that extra heart drops and things aren't wasted because they go towards the spell that you can use during like a tough battle or something to heal yourself. So as well as pretty good puzzle variety in the dungeons, there's also a good number of boss fights, many of which are optional. You'll find an entire optional side quest chain involving these bounty targets that you can hunt around the world to get to increasingly better rewards, like some rare gems and heart pieces and stuff. And the boss fights are actually pretty good, I think. They're the best parts of the combat. The combat itself is serviceable, but it's nothing special. It does the job, you know. It's a very basic combat system, so I guess it's not trying to be anything super flashy or advanced. And so because it's not trying to be advanced, it does what it sets out to do. But the boss fights are more interesting, of course, because they tend to involve some sort of environmental gimmick or usage of your various spells and items to do something to make them vulnerable or to defeat them in general. You know, you just have to think a little bit harder during boss fights, which I appreciate. And the game also does have its big, more involved dungeons, aside from all the smaller side ones that you'll find just by exploring, in the forms of the beacons. These are the places that you need to get to actually put those sacred artifacts back in place, and the beacons tend to be much more involved, significantly large dungeons with big story bosses at the end that often have some pretty advanced mechanics in them, honestly. The story boss fights definitely remind me of like Breath of the Wild boss fights, I would say. That might be what they're modeled after. They have a pretty good feel to them. Where the game does fall down a bit, though, is in the polish. You'll notice that sometimes animations are a bit stiff, or the cutscenes can be a little awkward with like moments of weird silence where you think there should be like environmental sounds, or some of the animations not quite syncing up or things like that. Just little bits of polish that show that the game does have a limited budget, so even though it looks quite beautiful, it has a really pretty, colorful appearance. It does have some other areas in which the polish is not as high as its graphical presentation's polish is. So you'll notice some bugs and things here and there. I've had the audio stop playing on me twice now, and I'm not sure what causes it. Just sometimes the audio completely cuts out. All the music, the voice acting, the environmental sounds, everything just stops playing, and you have to restart the game to get it back. I've also had a lot of problems with the AI bugging out. I've had enemies just sit in place and let me attack them, or just ignore me entirely. That happens relatively frequently. And I've also had a really big problem with ordering your party members around, because generally you're not adventuring by yourself. You actually have a couple of story important party members with you, and you can use the radial menu to tell them to do things. You can point at a switch and tell them to stand on it, or point at something and tell them to throw something at it, or things like that. And this is sometimes used for some of the more advanced puzzle solving and stuff to just add some extra mechanics to it. But I found that it is extremely easy to break the AI pathfinding in this game. Sometimes just telling them to stand on a switch causes them to stand in place and not know what to do, and you have to like leave the area and come back to sort of reset their AI. It gets pretty frustrating sometimes. If there's like any tiny thing like a blade of grass or some empty air in the way, sometimes they just won't really understand what you're trying to tell them to do, and they refuse to cooperate, which leads to some areas being a little bit frustrating because of how extremely easy it is to break the friendly AI in this game. But aside from a general lack of polish and the fact that the AI will sometimes frustrate you, I think the game is still actually worth trying out if you're really hungering for a Zelda-like experience, especially, like I said, a 3D Zelda-like experience, which is something that we don't get a lot of anyway on any platform. So I'd say in general this is something that's worth a look. Maybe get it on sale perhaps, unless you're like really needing a Zelda-like experience right now, because it is at least competent at that, but its general sort of issues and lack of polish make me want to say maybe wait for a sale on this one. I'll put the link in the description below this video so that you can go to the Steam store page and check it out for yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.